All right, folks. Hello, Spooniverse. Spoon Lady here. Now, those of you who have been following me for a while, you know some of my own story, that I spent a moment in my life floating around the United States on freight, hitchhiking, sometimes taking the occasional bus. That happens to be where I learned to play musical silverware and to street perform, and also where I started to become deeply interested in history. Now, putting that out there, I'm also fully aware that to many folks in the States, that traveling and backpacking Europe this way makes you eclectic and adventurous. But Americans traveling the U.S. this way, to many here in the States, makes you a bum or a vagrant. And we should probably talk about why that is and shouldn't be in a future episode. Now, I chose the name or phrase Hobo History because that's where I started, although it's become for me a phrase that encompasses more than just hobos, but working class history in general. I often get question popping up here that's, "Hey Abby, isn't that word hobo derogatory?" To which my answer is no. We're not using it in a derogatory way, as in the word bum here. We're talking about people who have been part of the traveling community or migratory workers in general. To many, the word hobo carries pride and dignity, myself included. And there's a phrase that is consistently used, which I immensely hate, about how a hobo will wander our work, and a tramp wanders and dreams, and a bum neither wanders nor works. And there's different variations of this saying, and they've been used as a kind of a classist defense of looking down on others. And that's also something I'd like to touch base on later. Now, before we start, I want to give a few disclaimers. No one will be teaching anyone how to hop freight trains on this show or channel. Sorry. If you came here for that, that is not this channel. Continuing that thought, I am not the only person who has had this kind of life. My life is my life, sure. I've been through my own adventures here and there, but I'm one of many, and I am off the road nowadays. So if you're looking to follow a modern-day traveler, I would investigate some old hobo shoestring videos or hop onto Anywhere Man's channel, or maybe Railcar Rosie. I've linked some of these channels in the comments. Also, to put it bluntly, I'm not the authority on hobo history or hobodom. There are many of us. We are not a political monolith. Everyone who has traveled with different experiences. They have different reasons to be on the road or to get off the road. I will from time to time, I'm sure, talk about anecdotal stories from my traveling time, but they're just that, anecdotal. Now, the truth is that you cannot study and understand the American hobo without understanding working class history in general. So, as I've stated before, the term hobo history for me is morphed into encompassing a whole lot of working class history. This is not going to be a project just about hobos, but about the working class in America. Examples of subjects would be the Mine Wars, the Haymarket Massacre, the World War I America Plan, or the Chamberlain-Conn Act. In fact, we'll be starting with a few of these subjects just to give us some good background as we tug along. So, some of the first subjects we'll be talking about will be the 8-hour workday, the year of the Great Uprising, 1877, perhaps the Knights of Labor, and the first Great Depression, or the Long Depression as it was called, the 1894 Panic, peonage and convict leasing. We should also brush over stuff like the Great Chicago Fire and the weird media and conspiracies that followed that. Also, the Paris Commune of 1871 and the way that was portrayed in the States. Coxey's Army and the Industrial Army Movement, which was actually the first March on Washington. I'm using air quotes, folks. I know you can't see me. There's also the bombing of Wall Street, women's suffrage, Palmer raids, even the impact of World War I on workers. So, of course, we'll be talking about historical figures, maybe folks like Eugene Debs. Hey, Denny. Or Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Mother Jones, Lucy Parsons, Big Bill Haywood, Jack Reed. Also, we can go over some famous court cases such as Sacco and Vanzetti, Joe Hill, and the McNamara brothers case about the 1911 Los Angeles Times building bombing. Okay, now we need to talk about isms. You don't need to subscribe to an ism to learn about an ism. We cannot talk about U.S. labor history without talking about radicals and isms. So, we are going to talk about all of the isms. Anarchism, socialism, communism, conservatism, liberalism, the list goes on. We aren't talking about today's politics. Hey, Denny, I don't know what ism you got, but you need to... We're talking. We aren't going to be talking about today's politics, but politics of the past. But I would be disingenuous if I told you that I wasn't hoping some of you might make a few lines and aha moments here and there. Now, that being said, I'm not going to tell you to go and grab yourself an ism, but I am going to tell you that you should learn about the isms because the posts that I see on social media lead me to lean very heavily into the idea, I agree, it's awful, that most folks have no idea what most of the isms we are going to talk about even mean to begin with. We may also touch on some isms that aren't talked about regularly, such as anti-intellectualism, or even doomerism, or the idea of Americanism. And then there's the word radical. There have always been folks who are looked at as radical. A good example of this from the past, or examples, would be those abolitionists who wanted not only to end slavery, but wanted full integration, and in some cases, restitution immediately. The other abolitionists looked at them as radical and even called them purists, or political purists, for attempting to push for such legislation. Women who wanted full equal rights, suffragettes, and the men who rallied for their cause, also called purists and radicals. But for now, I figured it was just a suitable time to sit and talk a bit about the history of the American hobo. Not a deep dive quite yet, but an overview so you could get a good grip about where we're going to be going with this in the future. So, the American hobo. Weary Willies, Wandering Waltz, Dusty Joes, Wayward Wanderers, Rail-riding Jacks. And don't forget, there were, in growing numbers as time trotted on, many female hobos, enough of them to worry the male bums, as many articles in the teens and 20s stated. Or drifting daisies, boxcar betties, transient Tessas, and vagabond violets. There have always been travelers or folks wandering to find work or family, searching for a place to call home, the elusive meaning of life. Although there have been travelers since the beginning of recorded history, what we look at in America as the beginning of a very distinct traveling culture started about the time that the railroad was first built, with a boom at the end of the Civil War and continual growth up into the turn of the century. At that time and past the Great Depression, the term hobo did not exclusively mean a migratory worker that traveled by freight trains, even if that is what comes to mind, but anyone who traveled in a migratory manner by foot, boat, living in carriages or vehicles, trains, buses, and especially for work. And as years went on, there were even a few airplane hobos. However, one cannot disregard the opportunities and mobility the railroad brought with it, and that it made the United States a more accessible place. Workers were following along the railroad and finding work not only with the railroad itself, but also in the railroad towns that popped up along the tracks. Constructions, road, farming. By the time the Civil War occurred, there was approximately 30,000 miles of track laid out across the states, built not only by the migratory workers, but by slaves, migrants, and convict laborers. Railroad barons took any opportunity they could to get as much work as they could for free or next to nothing. Now, this is going to be where the birth of labor unions really comes into play. Poverty wages and terrible working conditions with no protections, of course, is going to lead to workers wanting to organize. It's really only natural to want to take care of your families and have a better life. We will be talking about the Knights of Labor as an example, which was a precursor to the Wobblies or the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, that was later founded in 1905. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad happened in 1869, connecting the East and West Coast. By this time, the word hobo itself had been used more often in the American vernacular regarding the traveler or the migratory worker. Between the Civil War and the turn of the century into the Progressive Era, both homelessness and the iconic American traveling culture are what I have heard a few referred to as hobohemia, began to boom, and in a noticeably big way. There's tied to it some serious class consciousness. Now, I'd like to take a moment to explain something to folks who are new to the history of the hobo. When I talk about the unhoused population of people in the States during that time, I kind of want you to think of them in your mind as three separate groups when we're talking about the history of the American hobo, if you will, groups of folks. If you have the general population, first you have the general population of the stationary unhoused, or the poor even, that populate city centers. Then you have the population of migratory workers, those who are going from city to city doing, farming jobs, crop jobs, lumber jobs, those kinds of things. Now, most migratory workers, most folks would hit the road and generally not be on the road long. Generally, if you were part of this deal, you'd be gone a couple of months and you'd be back home or something like that, or you would find a stationary job and get a place where you found that job or whatnot. A lot of hobos did not actually stay on the road for long extended periods of time. The folks that did stay on the road for long extended periods of time is what I would like to refer to as that third group, which is the hobo culture. So again, we're talking about the general population of the unhoused or the homeless population, the general population of migratory workers, and then you have the hobos and the culture or hobohemia that sprouted up here. And a lot of those folks were the folks that were on the road chronically, or who chose to live on the road and work on the road in such a way, that they were long-term hobos. And so a lot of these hobos were the hobos that attended things like the hobo colleges and slept at hobo hotels and went to hobo conventions and participated in other aspects of traveling culture. So just kind of think about it. Look, the IWW hobos or the wobbly hobos would be another part of that. So just a little bit of a note when we're kind of thinking about this kind of history to thinking about the different ideas of the unhoused and traveling culture and the migratory workers and how that kind of worked out. Now, the Civil War obviously created hardships for many folks. There were businesses, homes and towns destroyed, cities destroyed. homelessness grew to immense proportions in the United States. The U.S. was suddenly full of wounded veterans, civilians, women suddenly single or without families, folks looking for lost relatives, especially freed slaves. Many taking to the road to find children or spouses or other family that they've been sold apart from as slaves. Or just a better life, somewhere they could now call home. Violence was rampant in many areas for black citizens and the homeless population. Homelessness in America had become quite the issue and stayed an issue for quite some time, and the media reflected it in some very interesting and dark ways, such as the tramp scare of the late 1800s. The tramp scare has been referred to by some historians as one of America's first media panics. It was further fueled by stories of international unrest in Europe. American papers warned that an army of homeless or tramp armies would rise and take over such cities as New York or Chicago. Newspapers spoke of the unemployed army and towns overrun by vagrants. Local militias in towns were formed to run homeless and hobos out of towns. Some newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune, spoke of doing such deeds as leaving arsenic-laced food out for vagrants, and spoke about them as if they were feral animals. Lynch mobs were formed, and hobos and homeless in some areas were run down and killed, and especially if you're a black homeless or a black traveler. Rarely did these newspapers speak of the actual economic reasons why the homeless population was booming. Instead, they blamed the unhoused themselves for their morality or their laziness. Papers on the East Coast would talk about whole homes and whole towns being overrun by these tramp armies, while papers on the West Coast would say that this was happening there. Happening on the East Coast, and this gave the illusion that tramps would be coming for you next, no matter where you were. Some of the articles you find are very obviously fake news or fake stories. You could catch many of these stories now looking back in the old archives, and they would often start with vague phrasing like, "it is said," or "it is told," with absolutely no follow-ups ever again. Often no names, no actual identifying information. Papers were full of crime, very often attributing crimes that have nothing to do with the unhoused or migratory communities, and attributing those crimes to tramps and hobos. Many of the public started to have fear of hiring homeless and traveling folks for labor on their properties for fear of being robbed or worse. This obviously made the situation bad. On top of this, there were fears of communism. That's one of those isms that we talked about. And many papers were laced with conspiracy theories that many of these wanderers were communists ready to rise up in one of these unemployed armies and take over such cities as New York or Chicago, the same way the working class had taken over Paris in 1871. The conspiracies surrounding this bit of French history were huge in the United States. In fact, this was the era that brought with it the rise of something called yellow journalism, which is characterized by sensationalist headlines, exaggerated stories, sometimes outright fake news, as folks would say today. So, we're talking about large banner headlines, wild illustrations, and the like. If a newsie or a paperboy could shout out a crazy-sounding headline from the corner, maybe even using scary-sounding words like communist or radical at the top of his lungs, he's likely to sell more papers than the boy yelling about local elections or whatever. Conspiracy theories were abundant. The more lavish the claim, the more papers you sold. Editors soon learned that fear and terror sold and moved papers out on the street. Now, there were lots of things going on at this point in history, such as the First Great Depression or the Long Depression, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket tragedy. Many railroads had crumbled and many banks had closed by 1895. skyrocketing the unemployment rate to 20%. This was a time of technological leaps, robber barons, public corruption, stunted reconstruction, racial strife that went to fuel the first Jim Crow laws that would impact the freedoms of hardworking Americans for generations to come. So, saying all this, it was not easy for America's earliest hobos and travelers. America desperately needed, yet degraded, its migratory workforce. By the time the turn of the century came, many hobos had realized their collective value as workers and journeymen. Unions, clubs, and societies began to form specific to the hobo. By the mid-1800s, hobo conventions and gatherings were becoming more regular. They were a place where you could go and discuss politics, laws that were going on, new jobs and work sites, and kind of get the lay of the land if you were new to an area. One remarkably interesting figure in hobo history would be the self-crowned first king of the hobos, Jeff Davis. And as said before, the term hobo encompassed many types of travelers, including those on wheels as the automobile became more popular. And although Jeff Davis did hop freight, some of his most famous photos of him are actually in his famous jalopy that was covered in graffiti and tags. Jeff Davis was a silent movie actor, a vaudeville performer, a public speaker, and started a group of hobos called Hobos of America, and took credit for opening a chain of hobo hotels referred to as Hotel de Ginks. Gink at the time was kind of slang for an odd person, so think Hotel Odd Person. The first one opened in Seattle in 1913, which he took credit for starting, but did not. He arrived after the press coverage started to get hot. And the most famous one might be the one he actually opened in New York City, riding the coattails of the media blitz that followed the Seattle de Gink opening. Later, the term Hotel de Gink became the general slang term for traditional military housing during the Second World War, which I find a bit interesting. Now, I must be honest. I am personally not a huge fan of Jeff Davis, the Hobo King. And like many hobos of his time, I tend to refer to him as the Hobo Dictator. But that's a story for further down the road. Meanwhile, James Eads Howe is the person I jokingly referred to as Jeff Davis's arch nemesis. And he and Jeff Davis had quite the rivalry between them. James Eads Howe was referred to as the Hobo Millionaire, as he inherited a bunch of wealth through his family. His grandfather was the civil engineer that built the Eads Bridge that went over the Mississippi into St. Louis, and his father was vice president and general manager of the Wabash Railroad. He went first to Meadville Theological School, then Harvard, and studied some medicine at the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Manhattan. He became a staunch vegetarian early in life and spent most of the money his family sent him while in school on the poor and needy, living off a bare minimum. He chose to dedicate his life to becoming a homeless advocate and spreading the ideas of Christian socialism. Howe went on to found something called the IBWA, or the International Brotherhood Welfare Association, which was a makeshift union for hobos run out of Cincinnati. Through this association, Howe funded a series of hobo colleges, possibly the most famous one being in Chicago, which was funded through the IBWA, and at one time was ran by Ben Rittman, the Hobo Doctor, which even held many debates with other colleges, including the University of Chicago. In 1917, they once debated the morality of birth control, as an example, and they won. These colleges taught about workers' rights, discussed the push for the 8-hour workday, sometimes even reading and math skills, English, sociology, industrial law, hygiene, philosophy, poetry, politics talk, government, birth control, job discussions. Heck, even the existence of God was discussed, with many religious speakers being invited. It was a place, especially in the winter, to come inside and perhaps grab a meal or coffee, sometimes even a bed or a space on the floor away from the elements. Famous speakers would come from all around the world to speak there, including Emma Goldman and Ralph Chaplin. He's the guy who wrote Solidarity Forever. And Lucy Parsons, who is the widow of one of the Hay Massacre martyrs and co-founder of the IWW. And even Clarence Darrow, the lawyer behind the famous Scopes Monkey trial. He went and he spoke there a bunch. Howe also started something called the Hobo News, which ran from 1915 to 1929. It was a Hobo ran newspaper. And the media would just jeer at him when one of his projects would fail, but he wouldn't let that ever deter him from his mission. The beginning of the 1900s also brought about the formation of the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, whose members were referred to as Wobblies. Founded in 1905 by such folks as Mother Jones, Lucy Parsons, Eugene Debs, and Big Bill Haywood of the Western Federation of Miners, the IWW would become a union to umbrella all workers, currently employed or not, and regardless of race or religion, within a few years. And it brought a new sense of solidarity amongst the generous portion of the hobo and traveling community. But it took a moment to get there. It took until 1908 for the IWW to even accept hobos, and it took the handy convincing of a wonderful traveling hobo brass band called the Overalls Brigade, led by J.H. Walsh. They hopped freight the 2,500 miles from the West Coast to the IWW convention in Chicago, passing out IWW literature and playing Union songs the whole way. They wore a uniform of matching denim overalls, black shirts, and red bandanas, symbolizing the rednecks or radicals that they were. Some IWW members did not like the hobo breed and referred to them as the bummery. The push to add the migratory workforce, however, to the IWW completely shifted the direction of the group into the direct action force that it would later become. One example of this solidarity and hobo-fueled direct action would be the free speech fights. There were about 30 free speech fights through the U.S. in the teens and 20s, and most of them, but not all of them, were out west. A few of the most famous of these fights being in Fresno, San Diego, Missoula, Montana, and Spokane, Washington. To summarize the free speech fights as quickly as I can, many of them went like this. Workers, including IWW members and union organizers, would utilize street speaking or soapboxing, since you'd often find something like a wood soap crate or similar to stand up on for a platform. They would speak about the 8-hour workday, about labor sharks. That's when they would make you buy a job. It was a whole racket. Workplace safety, wages, and more. The job sharks, the landowners, and the factory bosses would take offense and petition the local government to outlaw the practice of speaking in the street, and the police would start cracking down on workers. Eventually, protests and acts of oppositional defiance would follow. Now, how the hobos get involved here is kind of fun. Workers, newspapers, more radical papers would make a call out to hobos, floaters, miscellaneous, and literally ask for, and I quote, men to fill the jails. As a result, hundreds of hobos would come into town and literally stand on a box or other platform to speak in defiance. Many of them not actual soapboxers or street speakers to begin with, but people trying it out just for the sake of defiance. As soon as one was on a platform and saying, "My fellow workers," or sometimes they would start to recite the Pledge of Allegiance or the Constitution, the First Amendment was very popular. He was pulled down, often roughed up and arrested, and another was already on the platform waiting the same fate. The jails would fill up, and then the overflow spaces would fill up, costing the city a large amount of money to feed and take care of them. The conditions in jails were so bad and so packed that many lives were lost. Although not all the free speech fights were won for the workers, workers did win these fights with this tactic in several cities, and a few of the cities had to relent under the burden. In fact, the reason that a lot of old union or protest songs of the time are modeled after old gospel songs, such as Pie in the Sky, comes out of these fights and the frustrations the IWW had with the Salvation Army at the time. Remember that hobo band that we talked about earlier, the Overalls Brigade? The one that rode 2,500 miles to the IWW convention to add hobos to the ranks? Well, J.H. Walsh was there at a handful of these free speech fights with his band, and the most famous occurrence being in Spokane in 1909. The Overalls Brigade, donning their defiant red banners, would stand next to the Salvation Army when the Salvation Army would come out and do their street singing. They would call them the Starvation Army. They would sing their lyrics to those gospel songs, and standing right next to them, there would be the Overalls Brigade brass band singing their own lyrics to those gospel songs over the sounds of the religious singers in protest. They had literally written protest songs over the top of the lyrics of the religious music and passed out tracts to the crowd. Again, the free speech fights are another topic we should talk about in length in the future, and also the Little Red Songbook, which these song tracks eventually became. If everything goes well with this project, I see several episodes on the subject of free speech fights in the future. Okay, so here we are. My coffee is empty, and we've not even gotten to Coxey's Army and the Great Depression, the Overall Brigade, hobo symbols. Maybe we can get the Historical Graffiti Society in to talk about that one with us. Or the Hobo Code of Ethics, or the Hobo Zip Code, or Hobo Monikers, or the Hobo Hustles, or Hobo Nickels, or Hobo Clowns, or Hollywood Hobos, or Singing Hobos, and Stabbing Hobos, and Murder Hobos, and Infamous Hobos, and Hobo Heroes, and Airplane and Boat Hobos, or female hobos who are about written out of history, along with black, indigenous, and other hobos of color. We need to also talk about some of the laws that affected people, like white slavery laws. And no, I'm not talking about indentured servitude from earlier in history, but the Mann Act of 1910, or the Chamberlain-Conn Act of 1918, or the American Plan, as what it was called. There's a lot more to it than just a bearded feller riding through a mountain pass or grainer car porch with a loaf of bread, jug of red, and a lettuce head, watching the scenery, waiting for the next job. Hobo existence in America was, and still is, dirty, dangerous, often riddled with poverty and poverty wages, and heavily tainted with and by the politics of the day. Workers and hobos from non-English speaking backgrounds had even more hoops to jump through than their white English-speaking counterparts. Now, as we go through some of these stories, I'm going to press you that if you are doing your own research, to not completely rely on things like AI. It doesn't give you the full picture, and it literally makes stuff up, and especially when you're talking about things in history that haven't been fully studied, such as the American hobo. If you're going through old newspapers, which can be a great resource, please remember that these papers are just that. Papers written by biased people, and reading them can give you an idea of people's attitudes, their opinions of events, and help with dates and times, but should not be considered a primary source. Also, sometimes things you see on the internet need to be fact-checked. As an example, there's a bunch of great primary resources in the Hobo Archive put together by the folks at Britt, Iowa, but some of the essays in the archive about these figures have extremely and almost criminally factually incorrect information. A good example about that would be the essay that they have about Jeff Davis. That being said, I do think that the archive is a good idea and that the folks at Britt are kind and genuine, and then there are resources that are fun to go through. Another thing, When you're reading interviews, be skeptical, very skeptical of any interviews that are just the narrative of the interview and not the interview itself. Whether it be on paper or archive or anywhere, always look for the actual words of the people that lived it and not the narration of it, if it's accessible. Consider those sources second-hand sources, so to speak, not first-hand. I'll be keeping a running list of resources on my website, which is spoonlady.com, and on Patreon. I started a Discord server for Hobo History. The link is on my website, but I honestly just started poking at that platform, so please have mercy on me. I don't really know what I'm doing yet. Please let me know, too, if there's a person you think I should have a talk to as a guest on here, and about what subject. I've got some great ideas, and would love to hear your thoughts, too. So let me know what books you think I could read, or if you've read a book I've recommended, all those kinds of things. Now, speaking of books, I'm not sure how long we're going to be doing this thing on TikTok, and this is kind of off the subject, but if you use that platform, I've been reading storybooks at night, Monday through Thursday, 10 p.m. Central Time, and I mean stuff like Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. We did Narnia, Pearl and the Pumpkin, The Last Unicorn, The Magical Monarch of Mo. Right now, we're reading Sherlock Holmes, so we get on and I'll read whatever book we voted on for about an hour, hour and a half, sometimes more depending on the book and how people are feeling in the chat. We've been doing this since about the beginning of last summer or so, and I have no idea for how long I'll be doing the storytime thing, but it's been really fun to read some of these titles, and we have a great set of regular listeners on at night, so for now it's a thing. That's Monday through Thursday nights on TikTok. That's 10 p.m. Central Time. You do the math for wherever you happen to be. And a big shout out to my Storytime family. You know who you are. It's been a joy to spend evenings with y'all in a world of such chaos. And here's also where I shamelessly self-promote for monetary gain. If you are wanting to support this show or project, then Patreon is really the place to do it. There will be extras and interviews there, videos and book reviews. If I can get enough folks sponsoring on Patreon, then I can possibly add a team member to the project, which would be awesomeness. There's also microphones and equipment that we need to get, and so on and so forth. So yeah, Patreon is a great way to help out. Now, if you do draw lines to things in current politics, it's okay to comment. If there's something you feel that should be said, if you think I got something wrong or left something out, same. All I ask is that we keep it an academic conversation, and do not turn the comment sections into virtual fistfights. I've gotten folks asking me to touch on such subjects as George Soros and things of the like, but folks, I'm a labor history gal. I don't study George Soros. But yeah, outside of that, please keep things civil. Hate speech, bullying, that kind of stuff won't be allowed. So you'll just be booted, so just be kind. Now, it is true, though. Examining the past gives us stories galore. And not just stories of struggles and strife, but heroism and standing up for the little guy, stories about mutual aid and understanding your own self-worth. I want to tell you some of these stories, and I hope you'll find them as important and interesting as I do. It is easier to understand the road ahead when you know where you came from.